Not make age an issue of this campaign. I am not going to exploit for political purposes my opponent's youth and inexperience.
I could have been a contender. I could have been somebody.
We have great fans. I want to thank them for being here. So it's a great night for Nebraska.
The Nebraska Democratic Party is not going to have a sort of burning bush moment where everything gets turned around in one election. That doesn't happen.
The comments heard on Point Counterpoint Live are those of Mac McCoy and his guests and are not necessarily the opinions of producer Garth, Todd from Omaha Magazine, Dennis P. Crawford, the mail person, the guy on the street corner, old radio guy Marty, the church lady, Pastor Craig, or anyone else of sound mind and body. Now, here is today's Point Counterpoint Live, heard around the world on YouTube and Roku. Now, live from the Palacios Omaha Magazine studios, here's your host, Mac McCoy.
Welcome back to our third part of a three-part opening show. This is called Point Counterpoint. The idea is that we're hearing from both sides of the aisle. We don't get that. We don't get it on TV. We don't get it on radio. Maybe the audience will be small, but you're a part of it, and that makes it an important part because we want to hear both sides, and we want to hear the arguments and the debates on everything that's going on in our lives, and it's time that we bring both parties to the table to have these conversations. My co-host is Dennis P. Crawford, a retired trial lawyer and also held many nice positions in the Democratic Party.
That's right. I was a second associate chair from 2012 to 2016 of the Nebraska Democratic Party.
We're going to end this segment here in a little bit with a short conversation on abortion because I've come to a different realization on abortion than I had before, and I want to share it with you, and that's how we'll end this segment. But first, I want to talk about, we're starting this show on 9/11. It is the worst consumption of life for the reason of hate and war since probably the Civil War. Now, am I correct, I'm sorry, I don't mean to be disrespectful. Mrs. Harris.
Kamala Harris.
Yeah, she thinks that 9/11 was not the worst, right? She thinks that perhaps it was Pearl Harbor or World War II or something like that.
Well, that's a reasonable argument to make. I think over 2,000 Americans died at Pearl Harbor, for example. So it's.
But over 3,000 died at 9/11,
yeah.
And there's been another 6,000 die from breathing that toxic air.
Yeah,
so
that's a very good point. Your point
10,000 people.
It's just hard to say what is worse. They're all pretty bad, Mac. And my heart goes out to the families of the victims of 9/11. We mourn their loss, and we hope it never happens again. And we should remember how we were united on September 11 and shortly thereafter as a country.
Yeah. I don't want another war, and I don't want another attack from the bad guys, but I sure wish we could be united again and feel that way. We're probably farther apart in this country than we've ever been, except for probably the Civil War.
That's probably true. 1968 was pretty bad as well, too. So we've had these periods of division, and I've studied American history. We've been pretty polarized during most of our history. If you study the history of the founding fathers, with the George Washington administration, the John Adams administration, we're heavily polarized during those first two presidencies. We're heavily polarized during the Andrew Jackson presidency. So it's not a new thing. It kind of waxes and wanes. We have periods where we're less divided. We have periods where we're more divided. It just kind of waxes and wanes throughout American history. Yeah. This is a period of division, very much so.
So we've talked about wars that we've had inside of our own borders, terrorist attacks that we've had inside of our own borders. Let's talk a little bit about America's closest ally, Israel. Israel on October 7th was attacked by Hamas, which is a terrorist group. And I'm just going to say it up front. I don't know if the Palestinians are a part of it, but they do allow Hamas to hide inside them. well, it's not their fault. They got to do something. Yeah, do something. If you don't want people living in your town, in your country, in your neighborhood, you do something about it. And if you got to go to the level that they go to, then go to that. But protect your kids and your grandkids and get the terrorists out of your country. Now, I hope I can say that in 3 years from now, and we don't have terrorists living in our country that are pulling off such attacks. Dennis, here's what I don't understand about this. And I'm truly, I don't understand. Why are people taking Hamas's side when they were the ones that attacked Israel? To me, that's just, it doesn't make sense.
I suppose some people are. Fortunately, they're a very tiny minority who are taking Hamas's side.
Yeah, but they're all over our college universities. There's been some colleges that have lost heavy donors because they come from the Jewish community and don't understand why we've turned against the Jewish people. They've caused riots. They've caused deaths. I mean, is this as big as the protests we had for the Vietnam War?
No, it really isn't. It's just a tiny minority that are part of these protests. I mean, what Hamas did was absolutely despicable. They committed aggression. They committed war crimes. I'm glad a lot of the Hamas leaders have been killed or apprehended by the Israelis. I think the initial part of the war fought by Israel was justified. However, I think now is the time for a ceasefire. 40,000 civilians have died in Gaza since the war began. So I think now is the time for a ceasefire. I think it's about time for Israel to declare victory and end the war. I think they've won the war. And I think Bibi Netanyahu is continuing the war just to maintain his domestic political position. He's very unpopular. He has a very narrow majority in the Israeli parliament. And the only way to maintain power in the majority is to continue this war. But it should be ended.
Now, if I can recall correctly, 3-4 weeks ago, President Biden, this isn't about him, the president of our country was trying to negotiate a ceasefire. And what happens during that negotiation? Hamas kills a whole bunch of American and Israel prisoners of war.
Like I said, they're despicable. I mean, Hamas is the obstacle to a ceasefire agreement, but I think nonetheless efforts to end the war must continue. Too many civilians are losing their lives. This is a humanitarian disaster.
Okay, so what can we or the Israelis do with Hamas, who really isn't a part of the ceasefire?
Well,
they don't have any credibility inside those talks.
Well, one strategy the Israelis have adopted over the years is they track down and assassinate bad actors. Like after that attack at the Olympics in Munich in '72, they tracked down the Palestinians that massacred their athletes and just killed them one by one, creates a deterrent effect. And Iran is trying to build a nuclear weapon, and periodically Iranian nuclear scientists are assassinated in the streets of Tehran. So I think they need to end the war and then revert to the policy of trying to take out or apprehend the Hamas leaders that started this war and the slaughter of the innocents. I think that's a better strategy.
Would you call that strategy a Cold War?
I think it's a good description of it, Mac.
Okay.
I'd agree.
Yeah. Well, America's involved in this because when Iran and Hamas and those people say they want to take out Israel, they add and the United States. So we've got to be careful of what they can come over here and do to us. And you won't like this comment, but through all the illegal immigrants that have come across our border down south, you cannot tell me that one of those people, 100 of those people, 1 million of those people aren't here to hurt us.
I think it's pretty unlikely. I mean, there's been predictions. I remember during the days after 9/11, there were predictions that immigrants were going to cross the border and set up Al-Qaeda sleeper cells in America, and that apparently was a dog that didn't really bark.
Unless that's what they've been doing since Biden got into office.
Well, I mean, they predicted that was going to happen when Obama was the president. It never happened. So I think probably the fear of that is probably exaggerated.
Okay. All right. We thank you for tuning into our premiere show, Counterpoint. And this show is not only just going to cover national stuff, it's also going to cover a lot of local stuff. We've got a mayor here in Omaha that's being challenged in this next election. And a couple of the people that are challenging her is based around this streetcar that she's wants to put into Omaha. And a lot of people are ignoring the cost on that. We've got some hideous crime levels here in Omaha and even in Lincoln. I've been noticing, have you noticed, you live in Lincoln, there seems to be a little of an uptick on bad violence in Lincoln. Is that just I'm watching the wrong channels?
I don't know. I last looked at this issue about a year ago. There's a mayoral election in Lincoln about a year ago. The Democrat Leary and Gaylor Baird defeated a Republican state senator, Suzanne Geist, who was funded by the Ricketts family. And Geist's big issue was Lincoln was this crime-ridden dystopia. Well, I did some digging, and the rate of crime in Lincoln has declined since the 1990s. So at least as of 2023, the crime rate in Lincoln was lower than it was during the 1990s. So that's the last time I looked at it. The thing about the media is I like to emphasize bad news and I like to emphasize crime. If it bleeds, it leads. I mean, I've seen evidence in Omaha. The murder rate went up in 2020, but it's been down significantly in Omaha since 2020. The 2020 murder rate spike in Omaha was kind of a one-time deal related to the pandemic, and then it's gone down since then.
And it was also related to Black Lives Matter.
I think the pandemic really kind of unhinged the country for a few months. You had a lot of people that weren't working because of the lockdowns and the layoffs. And the police did not engage as aggressively in 2020 as they normally do for two reasons. A, they're afraid of getting in trouble with the law if they overdid it.
Yep.
I think they get it right most of the time, but they did mess up in Minneapolis with Floyd. And another thing was the leading cause of death for police in 2020 and 2021 was COVID, so they didn't want to engage because they didn't want to get COVID. I don't blame them. It was a terrible disease in 2020 and 2021, but the rate of murders I know in Omaha is down quite a bit since 2020.
I won't be alive for this, and maybe you won't either, but I can't wait to see how history writes COVID, because we've already worked outside the boundaries of what we know are absolutely true and blaming other people and coming up with things.
What's interesting is I read a book about the Spanish flu that came, the Spanish flu was in 1918, 1919. I read a book about it in the spring or the summer of 2020 when the COVID broke out around the world. And the interesting thing about the Spanish flu is there's like lockdowns of the population nationwide. Bars were closed, stadiums were closed, theaters were closed. And so, the business owners would protest because they were going broke. There's no PPP payments in 1918. And there was an anti-mask league in San Francisco. Here's a really interesting anecdote I ran across regarding the Spanish flu. I've been doing some research on the history of Nebraska football. Well, in 1918, there was no Nebraska football and no Creighton football games by decree. Creighton had a football team until 1941. Well, Creighton University just unilaterally declared one day in the fall of 1918, we're going to play a football game in defiance of the authorities, and they played this football game. And the director of the Omaha Department of Health actually attended the ball game. And so then University of Nebraska looked at Creighton and said, we're going to resume our season. And they resumed their season during the Spanish flu during 1918. And the final game in Lincoln, Notre Dame and Newt Rockne came to town with George Gipp and played to a 0-0 tie during the Spanish flu. So what's interesting is people resisted the lockdowns in 1918 and they did it in 2020. It's just human nature. I don't think those things work very well.
Well, we thank you for taking the time to join us on this first point counterpoint, and we'll get some of the bugs worked out, but probably not all of them. When you bring people in who don't agree on a lot of stuff, sometimes it gets a little heated. Dennis and I have both committed to the fact that we're going to talk more about policy than personalities, and today was a good example of that. We didn't get into a lot of the personalities. I just want to say something to my Christian friends. For those of you that don't know me, I'm a Jesus freak with an attitude. Most of my ministry is in Bible teaching and teaching of other classes through church, and I also do a couple of radio shows here on this platform. And my relationship with Jesus means everything to me. Now, given that, I'm going to ask my fellow Christians, my brothers and sisters, to consider something. We have this constant war of hate going on, and one of the particular points is abortion. And we can't seem to agree. On one side, you've got it's a woman's choice, and white Republicans shouldn't be making those choices for women. And my comment's always been, okay, if you think you can do anything you want with your body, then take off all your clothes, go out and sell yourself in prostitution. You can't do that. There's a lot of things we can't do with our bodies that take away rights. But I want to remember something extremely important. What happens to those little babies, those fetuses, when they are when they're killed in the womb, when there's an abortion? The Bible teaches us they go straight to heaven. I'm convinced that the thing that makes the devil madder than anything is abortion, because those are souls he doesn't get to touch. So if we're really Christians and this kingdom is not of my world, or this world is not of my kingdom, and we all know that we cannot push our beliefs on other people because we live in a free country. Sometimes we're the ones that are called bad names, and sometimes we call them bad names. Why don't we just let the abortion issue settle itself on that side of heaven rather than this side of heaven, and give up this red herring that we continually go back to, that men don't respect women's rights to choose? Well, guys, that woman didn't get pregnant by themselves. So maybe we need to step up too and start teaching our sons and our grandsons the facts of the birds and the bees. I know that's an old term, but we ought to maybe talk about it, because that woman cannot get pregnant without the guy, at least not yet. We'll see what science does. Let's get off that bandwagon and let God handle those babies, because he created them, and he's the one that's going to bring them home the minute they're discarded on this planet Earth. Just something to think about. I'm Mac McCoy. If I haven't told you lately, thanks for listening. Love this job. Couldn't do it without you. Right here on two channels, The View from a Pew, and also now Point Counterpoint. First time in 20 years we've added a show to this schedule. And our worldwide sponsor for both shows is Divine Truth Christian Store. Anything you need, they're there. Online or at 84th and Harrison.
Divine Truth Christian Store, where you'll find more.